Alright guys, how's it going? And no, this isn't your favorite Scottish YouTuber, but if you keep watching, I'm sure you'll find this interesting. This is Alex from AdoredTV, and today we've got something a bit different. I'll be diving into why the Ryzen 5600X absolutely demolishes the previous 3rd gen CPUs in 15 really popular multiplayer titles. As you may know, PC gaming has exploded over the past few years, and a bulk of these people play competitive multiplayer or eSports games. And for any of those people, or anyone who just wants to get straight to the results, feel free to skip ahead. Esports gamers have typically been buying Intel CPUs in order to get the highest possible FPS in those titles. As Ryzen's Achilles heel has always been high FPS gaming, which in this case is almost entirely latency based. Gaming in and of itself is a latency based application since you need to draw X amount of frames per second. This is partially due to the fact that Intel has held the lead in clock speed and, to a varying degree, IPC in lightly threaded tasks. And AMD's latency issues with its Infinity Fabric. AMD has even made sure to mention this at the Ryzen 5000 launch, at how they've taken the lead in esports titles and they have the fastest gaming CPUs in the market. What AMD has specifically done with its Zen 3 architecture, aka Ryzen 5000 series, was to fix the major flaw in its architecture for gaming, which is some games specifically lean hard on one thread. Words like unoptimized, single core, and others might spring to mind. Ryzen 1 through 3000 series lacked the ability to allocate all of their cache to the most heavily worked cores. Each generation has improved this incrementally, with the current model being the largest leap, with this generation also improving on the core's ability to communicate with one another. So this channel has a bit of history in complaining on reviewers for using lower resolutions and lower settings and benchmarks, and as Jim has once said,
playing Tomb Raider at 1080p on normal settings at 350 frames per second, nobody in their right mind is going to do that. You're much more likely to take 150 frames per second on ultra settings instead, due to the practically imperceptible differences between 350 and 150 frames per second.
However, today I'm doing something a little bit different. I'm specifically looking at popular multiplayer titles, as I feel they're generally ignored by the press. And I, like other reviewers, do have a standard set of games that I test for reviews, but what I'm doing today is a little different. These titles I see are games that are popular on Twitch, some of my friends play, have a strong fan base, or, in the Steam top 10 games list. It's also important to note that for these gamers, these frame rates might actually be what they want. Tomb Raider at 350 FPS makes no sense, but these esports and competitive multiplayer games, it's a different story. As a bit of an anecdote, this really isn't a new phenomenon, as back when I played Battlefield 3 competitively, one of our top fraggers played on a 580 on low in order to never drop below his monitor's refresh rate. For those of you who've gamed competitively or have friends who do, you'll know how important maxing out your FPS to match the monitor's refresh rate is. Also, with competitive gamers switching over to 240Hz in a bunch of titles, and with newer 360Hz panels constantly selling out, and also with the higher refresh rate monitors in the works, we really are looking at sort of a moving target here. I have tested what's generally accepted as competitive gaming settings, and that'll typically be low. However, notes will be made for specific games, as certain games will have shadows at medium instead of low, and textures at high for specific reasons that their community may have found for one reason or another. This is to try to recreate a real scenario as close as possible. For this video, I will be using the following hardware: a Ryzen 5600X, and a Ryzen 3600X, an ASUS B550 Strix E motherboard, 16 gigs of G-Skill Trident Z Gold at 3600 MHz CL14, and a Powercolor Radeon 6800 Red Dragon. The Radeon cards are supposed to be better at 1080p gaming, although honestly it was chosen because it was what I had on hand. This was also a loaner card, so my time with the card was limited. With that out of the way, let's get to the games. So, for CSGO, we tested at medium settings and in 2 resolutions, at 1080p and 960p, which is 4x3 stretched. This is a really popular resolution for competitive gamers to use, as much as I hate it. For this test, we used the benchmark from the workshop and run the test for 90 seconds. Note that FPS drops tend to happen during explosions and smoke grenades. This is something that CS players have complained about for years. At 960p, we see a pretty impressive 41.5% increase on average and a 38% increase on the 99th percentile. So a pretty big jump here. At 1080p, we see an even larger increase of 45%. However, oddly enough, the minimum frames are only a 25% increase. Call of Duty Warzone I tested in a training match for 120 seconds at low settings in DX12. I used the average of 5 runs instead of 3, as almost all the other games are, to try to iron out any variability, and I had to throw out quite a few runs. For this test, we see a 13% increase in average FPS and a 15% increase in the 99th percentile. I believe this is partially due to COD being better optimized than a game that uses many more threads. This showing isn't as impressive as CS and one of the more minor increases throughout the whole list of titles, but this is a really impressive improvement for those looking to push 240 Hz consistently. For Dota 2, we used the replay of a pro match and recorded for 120 seconds, which involved a team fight towards the middle. It was tested at high textures and everything else at low at 1080p in DX11. Here we see a 46% performance jump on the average and just under a whopping 60% performance increase in the 99th percentile. The jump from 82 to 131 is a noticeable leap that most people would be able to appreciate. On to one of the most popular and widely hated titles out there. I tested Fortnite, and as a reviewer, sometimes you have to test things that you really don't care for. Doing some digging, I found a benchmark that is likely a bit overkill, but was incredibly repeatable. It was tested for 60 seconds at 1080p low in DX11. DX12 actually showed a little bit of a regression. For the average, I saw nearly a 38% performance increase and a 20% performance increase on the 99th percentile. And for those who play this game, this might be an interesting result. Now on to Blizzard's Heroes of the Storm, a semi-popular MOBA which several of our community members play. Once again, I used the replay here to get a consistent result. Our team fight here is less intensive than the Dota test, which may contribute to the results you'll see now. The game was tested at 1080p on low settings in DX11. For the average FPS, we see a pretty massive performance increase of 77% over the previous generation, and in a reversal of what we saw with Dota, a 41% performance increase in the 99th percentile. Again, this may partially have to do with the fact that the test was a bit lighter on the system overall, or just due to the differences between the games and the engines themselves. For Apex Legends, we tested using the training grounds for consistent performance and unlocked its frame rate to the maximum of 300 FPS. This is with low and medium settings mixed, as players generally recommend. There isn't really too much to talk about here besides the fact that the results are the exact same, and in some cases, there really isn't a reason to go from one CPU to the other. In playing a few matches with both CPUs at these settings, it seemed about the same as well. For PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds, the game that started this whole Battle Royale craze, we tested at 1080p with ultra textures and view distance, with everything else set to low. I used the replay of one of my own games for 2 minutes. It includes parachuting and landing in a pretty populated area. Looking at the average, we see a 24% increase, with the average jumping over 165 FPS, and a 26% increase in performance in the 99th percentile. Rogue Company is a popular class-based team third-person shooter that took Twitch by storm last year. In this game, we tested at max settings as it makes absolutely no difference with this GPU, and tested during the tutorial for 90 seconds. The frame rate here is off the charts, especially considering how hard the game wanted to fight me to get it to uncap. That being said, the 53% average FPS is quite impressive. However, the 59% 99th percentile jump in FPS is fantastic for those with 240 Hz monitors. Now on to Rainbow Six, a first-person competitive shooter which I've had a few hundred hours sunk into over the past couple years. For Siege, I decided to test in 2 different scenarios. For the first, I did an offline match against bots, and for the other, I did the CAN benchmark. I'd also tried to do 4.3 testing, however it had no real performance impact. For the bot match, I did a run-through for 120 seconds in the cafe map. All settings were set to low, and the API used was Vulkan. The results on the average FPS is a staggering 94% increase and is one of the biggest performance differences in any of the games that we've tested for this video. Looking at the 99th percentile, the number is even higher with a 105% increase, which is over double. Now on to the new canned benchmark. We see a 40% increase in the average FPS and a 28% jump in the 99th percentile, which, while good, is not the same as the numbers previously shown, and a part of this is the fact that the CPU really isn't being pushed all that hard. The testing of the canned benchmark for CPUs probably isn't ideal if you're trying to capture realistic performance. Although testing the other way did take a significantly longer amount of time, probably 5 to 10 times longer due to the amount of runs you just have to throw out. Starcraft 2, though pretty long in the tooth, is still one of the most popular RTS games out there with an eSports scene that still exists. For this, we tested the benchmark in the arcade for 120 seconds at low settings. For the average FPS in this really taxing scene, it shows over a 97% lead over the previous gen 3600X, which is a whole lot. For the 99th percentile, it's about 55%, which is still quite impressive, though honestly the difference between 9 FPS and 14 is still pretty much unplayable. But this is one of those overkill tests that is the absolute worst case scenario possible. On to one of the most popular titles of last year, Escape from Tarkov. An early access first-person shooter, survival MMO thing that is hard to define and a personal favorite of mine. I tested using mixed settings from the video linked below. The run is 120 seconds in an offline mode on the reserve map in patch 12.6, which was known to be one of the worst running maps in the game. An interesting side note is Tarkov is limited to 120 FPS, or the maximum refresh rate of your monitor, which in my case is 165 Hz, meaning, oddly enough, my monitor was the bottleneck, and theoretically the 5600X could perform even better on a higher refresh rate monitor. In the average FPS, we see the 5600X leading the 3600X by a 31% margin, and a 30% margin in the 99th percentile, which is still quite impressive on a game that has some optimization issues. Valorant is a Riot Games FPS that has been called a mix of both Overwatch and CSGO and was an instant hit. For the run, I did the shooting trainer in the training area, which is not really indicative of a heated match. However, the percentage difference during an actual game seems roughly the same, although let me know if you guys have any suggestions for this title. Valorant gets just an absurd 1000 FPS on average with the 5600X, so much so that I actually got pretty loud coil whine from the GPU. The 500 plus FPS from the 3600X was still pretty respectable, at least from an academic sense though. Double the performance gain again is massive. It's slightly over double again for the 99th percentile, though for most users, except those that are looking at 240Hz plus monitors who need to get their monitor's refresh rate all the time, 3600X would be great for Valorant. For War Thunder, I used the tank battle benchmark on low settings. The air battle test scaled similarly, but we're again in that 700 plus FPS mark, which just seemed excessive. For the average FPS, we have double the FPS gain from the 3600X to 5600X, and a 43% gain in the 99th percentiles. World of Tanks has an external benchmark that I use to round out our list. I tested using DX11 at medium settings and recorded the test for 3 minutes. There was at least a 17% difference in the average FPS and a 14% difference on the 99th percentile, though both of them never dropped below 400 FPS. If the benchmark is similar to the actual game in action, both of these CPUs are doing just a tremendous job in this title. So, in doing this testing, honestly, I was shocked once I saw the results. I thought the best case scenarios would be 40 to 60% faster rather than double. One of the reasons why I decided to test the games the way I did today was the fact that Intel held such a lead in competitive gaming, And this was Intel's primary strength. I had intended to test the 9900K I have as well, but due to time constraints, I could only do these two CPUs before I had to send the card back. So, with the release of Ryzen 3000, AMD had mostly caught up to Intel in gaming workloads, but were just lacking in ultra-competitive shooters and other eSports titles where high frame rates are not just expected, but demanded. And while many users are fine with the performance on previous processors, there are some who absolutely demand the best possible performance. All other things, including price, be damned. With that, I'm not really saying that everyone watching this video needs to throw out their 3000 series chip, or even the first and second gen models. However, if you play most games in graphics-bound scenarios and you aren't running a 3090, the difference between these CPUs tends to be negligible, as other reviewers have shown. However, if your aim is hitting the highest possible FPS in these titles shown today, 5000 series parts show a great option in the same existing platform for users who already have the supporting motherboards. For any future testing you'd like to see, please let us know in the comment section. I plan on testing different types of games in the future, or I can do the higher end CPUs, add an Intel part, or redo these tests on an NVIDIA card. The shortlist for me is testing these CPUs with an i5-11400 and the RTX 3070, as well as doing these sorts of tests but with milsims and flight sims. As always, please be sure to comment your thoughts on the format. Give us a like if you like the video, and subscribe. Also, check out the Patreon if you're willing to help fund us.